In 1002, as the dawn of the Middle Ages touched the shores of England, troubles threatened a fragile peace that hung over the country. In the land where the whispers of the wind cried tales of dense forests, vast moorland, and fertile fields, Anglo-Saxon villagers, in small and close-knit villages that dotted the countryside, began to speak of their deep-seated discontent at the crown for their handling of the Danes who lived in the Danelaw. The rhythm of daily life was deeply tied to the land. Life was a constant struggle to extract sustenance from the earth. The fields in the south and the east were rich and bountiful. They promised harvests that could stave off hunger, while the rugged north and the west demanded resilience from those who herded sheep and cattle. The lay of the land had been irrevocably altered in the 9th century by the foundation of the Danelaw, an area of northern and eastern England where Danish rule was the law of the land. From London to Chester, the influence of the Norse settlers was palpable. Yorkshire, East Anglia, and the Five Boroughs of Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, and Stamford were strongholds of Danish customs and governance. The Norse and the Anglo-Saxon cultures mixed, creating a unique tapestry of traditions and laws, and culminating in mass conversions from Nordic pagan beliefs into Christianity. At the heart of the Anglo-Saxon land, King Ethelred II ruled. Known as Ethelred the Unready, his throne was less a seat of power and more a precarious perch atop a kingdom beset by challenges. The Viking menace loomed large, with fierce warriors from across the sea seeking to carve out their own dominion. The king's reach extended only as far as the loyalty of his local earls, men who governed vast swaths of land, collected taxes, upheld the law, and commanded military might in his name. The realm was a patchwork of alliances and feuds, where the king's word had sway only with the support of these powerful men. The relationships between Ethelred's England and the Danelaw was a delicate balance of peace and tension. Periods of an uneasy truce were punctured by bursts of conflict, as the spectre of Viking raids loomed large. In his effort to bring the Danelaw into the fold, Ethelred often resorted to paying Danegeld, hefty sums meant to buy temporary peace from the Viking chieftains. Yet these payments were but a bandage over a festering wound, as regions under the Danish influence maintained a semblance of independence, resisting full integration into the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. As the people and the nobility cried for response to the threats posed by the Norsemen, Ethelred responded, but with one decision he doomed England to the wrath of Scandinavia. Hi everybody and welcome back to the Dark History Podcast, where we explore the darkest parts of human history. Hope everybody is well. I'm Rob, your host as always. Welcome to Season 3, Episode 17, Blood and Retribution, the St. Brice's Day Massacre, and Viking Vengeance. In today's episode, we're diving into the chaotic mess that was England in the early 11th century. At this time, England was fractured into several competing kingdoms, struggling to maintain stability amidst the constant turmoil. Viking raiders from Scandinavia continued to wreak havoc, raiding and pillaging with little resistance. King Ethelred II of England, faced with these relentless attacks, opted to pay Danes living in the Danelaw hefty tributes known as Danegeld, rather than engage them in battle. This strategy of appeasement, however, was only a temporary fix. In 1002, the situation took a dramatic turn when Athelred ordered the St. Brice's Day Massacre, aiming to exterminate every Dane living in England. This decision, driven by fear and frustration, had catastrophic consequences. Instead of securing his kingdom, Athelred's actions provoked a fierce response from the Danes, leading to even more violent invasions and cementing his reputation as an ineffective ruler. The fallout from this massacre would shape the future of England, as the kingdom grappled with the aftermath of such a drastic and brutal policy. Before we start, I just want to tell you about this week's podcast of the episode, the Swerve Podcast, but we will have a sneak peek of their show later in the episode. So without further ado, please turn off those lights, sit back and relax next to the fire for more dark history. Before diving into the story, it's important to understand how England had gotten into the state it was in the year 1002. Repeated Viking raids had savaged the land of England since the first attack in 792 CE. The attack on the monastery at Lindisfarne, one of the holiest places in England, marked the Vikings out as warriors who feared nobody, not even the wrath of God. To Christian England, they seemed fearsome, and some believed they were sent as a punishment from God. Their more earthly intentions soon became apparent as they stripped the northern cities of gold and precious objects and began to take land and settle. At the start of the Middle Ages, England was a fractured land, divided into three distinct parts. In the northeast lay Northumbria. England stretched from the northwest to the southwest and along the southern coast. Nestled in the middle was the Danelaw, a region under Danish control, established by the Treaty of Cheltenham in 878, following the invasion of the Great Heathen Army. Led by the formidable Halfdan Ragnarsson, Ivar the Boneless, and Guthrum in 865. The Danish leader of the Vikings, Guthrum, made a peace settlement with King Alfred of Wessex that included the condition that Guthrum and his followers became Christian. Guthrum and Alfred divided the kingdoms of England between them, and the eastern part was known as the Danelaw, where the Danes ruled with their own laws. Many Danes settled in the kingdom of East Anglia and Northumbria. The establishment of the Danelaw and the death of Eric Bloodaxe, the Viking king of Northumbria, in 954 signalled the withdrawal of Viking forces and a cessation of violence for 25 years. However, in 980, the raiders returned and began a new onslaught on port towns. King Athelred the Unready, or the Ill-Advised, had ascended to the throne at the tender age of 12 in 978, following the murder of his stepbrother at Corfe, on the orders of Athelred's own mother. His reign was fraught with challenges and instability. Despite a semblance of peace within England's borders, the threat of Viking raids from Scandinavia loomed large. In 991, the Norwegian leader Olaf Tryggvason secured a decisive victory in the Battle of Meldon in Essex, only to return in 993 to plunder the northeast. The following year, he joined forces with Sweyn Forkbeard, the Danish king, to launch an attack on London, which ultimately failed. Undeterred, Olaf turned his fury on the southeast, prompting Athelred to buy him off with a hefty sum of Danegeld. And here we are talking an exorbitant amount, 24,000 pieces of gold, enough to make Olaf the king of Norway. Unlike his predecessors, Athelred rarely led his troops into battle, a decision that left his regime struggling to find an effective leader. He sought to bolster England's defences by strengthening the navy and paying Dane geld to deter the Viking aggression. Athelred earned his ironic nickname through a series of unexpected and complicated decisions. One such decision was to pay Olaf to become King of Norway, which indirectly forced Olaf's ally, Sweyn Forkbeard, to return to Denmark to deal with the new political landscape. This arrangement also stipulated that Olaf became Athelred's ally and leave England. Additionally, Athelred took on a number of Viking mercenaries who became his confidants. Moreover, Athelred forged a crucial agreement with Duke Richard of Normandy, ensuring mutual non-support of each other's enemies. However, in 1001, Athelred's title of the Unready seemed fitting once more when Sweyn returned to England after quelling unrest in Scandinavia. Athelred paid him off, again. This time, the Viking mercenaries Athelred had previously hired from Olaf switched sides, joining Sweyn's army and betraying Athelred. I really hope everybody's following along. In the spring of 1002, Athelred solidified his alliance with the Normans by marrying Emma, Duke Richard's daughter, a formidable and influential woman in her own right. She helped to unite the Danes and the Anglo-Saxons and had a lasting impact on England's history. However, their marriage did not have an immediate impact that Athelred had hoped for. In his haste for a solution to the problem, he decided to use an upcoming holy day to assert his authority. The St. Brice's Day Massacre occurred on the 13th of November 1002, on the orders of King Athelred. He had been told that the Danes in England would faithlessly take his life, and then all of his counsellors, and then possess his kingdom. We're going to take a little break here, but while you wait, here is a sneak peek of today's podcast of the episode, the Swerve Podcast.
Break free from the ordinary and check out a podcast with thought-shattering concepts that will reshape the way you interpret the world.
We are the Swerve Podcast, and our mission is very simple. Each episode, we research and discuss topics that swerve off the mainstream path in an attempt to understand everything in the universe, one obscure topic at a time.
Whether you're into forgotten history, cutting-edge science, strange frontiers of the unknown, or just need a good laugh in an uncensored way, the Swerve Podcast has you covered.
Listen to the Swerve Podcast today on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any other major platforms.
Welcome back. Now, to sort of break the allure of the story, the St. Brice's Day Massacre has been built up by late Middle-Age chroniclers as what we would call today an ethnic cleansing. But what they wrote was more hyperbole and wasn't really what happened. The Danelaw was never touched. The mercenaries that Athelred had originally taken from Olaf were the real targets. But this edict did spill out to the border town of Oxford. Now, with a very small amount of artistic licence, on the cold morning of November the 13th, 1002, the streets of Oxford and other parts of England were eerily quiet, yet brimming with tension. King Athelred the Unready had decreed that all Danes in the kingdom should be slain, a desperate attempt to quell the Viking invasion that had been ravaging his land. This decree, known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre, was rooted in fear and desperation, and would lead to a day soaked in blood and betrayal. In the heart of Oxford, the Danish settlers were oblivious to the storm brewing around them. The Danes in England had become an integral part of society, blending through marriages, trade, and shared customs. Despite their Viking heritage, many had long abandoned a life of raiding for one of farming and craftsmanship. Danes were working their jobs when the English soldiers assembled near their towns. At first, they thought nothing of it. Soldiers often patrolled the streets. but as they observed their tense faces and whispering conversations, a sense of unease began to grow. Meanwhile, inside a nearby church, a woman and a child gathered for the morning prayers. Among them were the Danish women. They prayed for peace and prosperity, unaware of the deadly decree that hung over them. The order had come from King Ethelred himself, who was haunted by visions of Viking ships and tales of brutal raids. His advisers had convinced him that the Danes within England's borders were a fifth column and a threat from within. Believing that drastic measures were necessary to secure his kingdom, Ethelred issued the fatal edict. As the church bells tolled, signalling the end of the morning service, the soldiers made their move. As the collective's hearts pounded, they saw them march towards the church. The men dropped their tools and ran, shouting a warning, but their voices were drowned out by the soldiers' battle cries. The massacre was swift and brutal. The soldiers stormed into houses, dragging people into the streets and cutting them down. The Danes fought desperately to reach their families, but the chaos was overwhelming. The church, meant to be a sanctuary, became a slaughterhouse, as the soldiers showed no mercy, even to women and children. People tried to fight through the soldiers, using their tools as weapons, but ultimately they were outnumbered. In the aftermath, the streets of Oxford were littered with the bodies of the slain. The massacre had spread across the kingdom, leaving thousands of Danes dead. King Ethelred believed he had secured his throne, but the massacre only deepened the divide between England and the Danes. The Danes that survived, their hearts hardened by grief and rage, took their families and fled to the wilderness, swearing vengeance against those who had betrayed their families. As the years passed, the tales of the St. Brice's Day massacre spread, a grim reminder of the consequences of fear and hatred. King Ethelred's edict had been meant to protect his kingdom, but it only sowed the seeds of bitterness and bloodshed. The massacre did not end the Viking threat. Instead, it spurred further violence and reprisals. It took some time, but eventually the tales of the Norsemen's dead reached the kings of Scandinavia. Gunhild, the sister of the Danish king, found herself caught in a deadly game of politics and power. As legend goes, she was held hostage by Ethelred, king of the Anglo-Saxon, during a turbulent period when tensions between England and the Danes were simmering dangerously close to boiling. Her fate took a tragic turn with the delivery of Ethelred's notorious edict, a decree that led to the brutal massacre aimed at Danes living in England. Amidst the chaos and bloodshed, Gunhild was allegedly killed, her life extinguished by the very king who had kept her captive. Yet, her remains were never found, leaving a haunting void in the historical record and casting a shadow of mystery over her final moments. Gunhild's husband, Pálig, played a pivotal role in this dark chapter. Initially a trusted servant of Ethelred, Pálig's alliances shifted as he betrayed the king and joined forces with the marauding raiders who laid waste to Anglo-Saxon settlements. This act of treachery did not go unnoticed, and fueled a deep sense of betrayal and paranoia within Ethelred. Some historians speculate that the king's edict, which called for the extermination of the Danes within his realm, was not solely a strategic move, but also a personal vendetta against Pálig for his desertion. The death of Gunhild and Pálig resonated far beyond their immediate circle, rippling through the corridors of power in Denmark. The Danish king, upon hearing his sister's tragic end, and his brother-in-law's betrayal and subsequent death was consumed by grief and rage. These personal losses were more than just familial tragedies. They became a rallying cry for vengeance. In 1003, the Danish king made a decisive move, marshalling his forces to invade England. This invasion was not merely a quest for land or power, but a deeply personal mission to avenge the deaths of Gunhild and Porlig, and to punish Athelred for his ruthless actions. Sweyn Forkbeard's attacks on England were of an unprecedented scale. His forces pillaged and plundered with ferocity, and struck terror into the hearts of the populace. Villages were razed, treasure looted, and entire communities decimated. The devastation was so immense that King Athelred, in a desperate bid to provide respite for his people, resorted, once again, to paying off the Danes. However, the temporary peace was a fragile illusion, and the raids continued sporadically, maintaining a constant state of fear and instability within the kingdom. By 1013, Sweyn was ready to launch a more decisive campaign. He landed at Sandwich in modern-day Kent with an even larger and more determined force. This time, his invasion was marked by an unrelenting onslaught. Town after town fell to his army as he carved a path of destruction through England. The terrified locals, unable to withstand his might, submitted to his forces, hoping to avoid further bloodshed. As Sweyn marched towards London, he encountered stiffer resistance. The defences of the city were led by Athelred and his formidable ally Thornkeld the Tall, a legendary Viking warrior who had switched sides to support the English king. At first, they managed to hold their ground against Sweyn's forces. The streets of London echoed with clashes of swords and the cries of battle as defenders fought valiantly to protect their city. However, the prolonged siege began to take a toll. The people of London, already weary and frightened, started to fear the severe reprisals that Sweyn's vengeance would bring if they continued to resist. The spirit of defiance began to falter, and disillusionment with their beleaguered king grew. Seeing no alternative, and desperate to preserve what remained of their lives and property, the English earls reluctantly declared Sweyn as their ruler. With the tide turned against him, Athelred fled into exile. He first sought refuge on the Isle of Wight, but realised the precariousness of his situation. He soon crossed the sea to Normandy. There, he found a measure of safety, but his kingdom was now under the control of his Danish adversary. Sweyn Forkbeard was proclaimed King of England on Christmas Day in 1013, a momentous event that signalled the culmination of his long campaign. However, his triumph was short-lived. Just weeks later, on February the 3rd, 1014, Sweyn died suddenly at his capital in Gainsborough, Lincolnshire. The exact cause of his death remains shrouded in mystery. One account describes a tragic fall from his horse, while another suggests he succumbed to a stroke or apoplexy. Sweyn's body was initially buried in England, but later it was transported to Roskilde Cathedral in Denmark, where he was laid to rest among his ancestors. Despite the brevity of his reign, Sweyn Forkbeard's impact on England was profound. His invasion and subsequent upheaval reshaped the landscape of power and left a legacy of turmoil and conflict. In the aftermath of Sweyn's death, England faced a period of uncertainty. Athelred, from exile in Normandy, would soon be called upon to return and reclaim his throne. The cycle of war and peace, betrayal and allegiance, would continue to define the tumultuous relationship between England and the Viking invaders. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to this dark episode. Now, as I said with this episode, a very little amount of artistic license was taken here. The chroniclers of later times embellished the massacre. We sort of know this because archaeological evidence has shown far fewer people were killed in the actual violence on St. Brice's day. As for the legend of Sweyn Forkbeard's sister, well, you may have to take this with a pinch of salt. The Danes did invade under the King of Denmark. They did conquer England, but the reasoning for this is lost to myth and legend. We do know that on the death of Sweyn Forkbeard, who died the King of Norway, Denmark and England, Athelred returned from exile and ruled until his death in 1016. Likewise, the throne of Norway passed to his natives. However, Sweyn's son, Canute, would later revive his father's empire. Canute ruled England much longer than his father, giving him more time to impress the English with what he had done. His deeds were recorded by English writers of the time, and hence he is known today as Canute the Great. Eventually the Danes would be vanquished at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, when William the Conqueror defeated the Anglo-Saxon Danish king Harold Godwinson, and the rest, as they say, is history. Anyway, if you could please drop a review on the show, it really does help the podcast out. The more reviews, the more the algorithm pushes the show out there. If you think friends and family may be interested in the podcast, then share it with them. Links to all socials are below. I know adverts can be a pain sometimes. If you would like ad-free episodes, the link to the show's Patreon is below. The Patreon is for people who want to support the channel, but you don't have to. As always, if you've been listening for a while and not subscribed, please do that. In that way you never miss an episode. So, with all that out the way, thank you again for listening. Join us next time for our next episode, as we delve into another event and more dark history.